Our next question comes from Lyndall Curtis.
I'd like to ask a question first to you, Mr Abbott, and Mr Rudd, about aged care. Well, it's about 6 million voters in this election are aged 50 and over. 2 million of those are aged 70 or over. That's a lot of people who are either thinking about care for themselves or their parents. The government made a major change in policy legislated earlier this year with almost no publicity. Mr Abbott, you don't have a detailed aged care policy. In your Real Solutions booklet, I think your aged care statement ran to about a paragraph. What would a coalition government do? And Mr Rudd, can you explain what the central changes are and whether there would be any more?
Thanks, Lyndall. Look, all of us absolutely accept and understand that we do need better aged care systems. Most of us have had aged relatives in aged care institutions of one sort or another. I've certainly had both of my grandparents in aged care institutions. They're good, but we want them to be better. Essentially, our policy will be about reducing the paperwork that aged care providers face, because if they're spending less time doing bureaucracy, they'll have more time and more money to spend on providing better care.
But the government's changes were quite wide-ranging. They went to not only making the process easier, but looking at how aged care is paid for, how people pay for it themselves. What will you do on that policy?
Well, I accept that it was quite a detailed set of changes, and it was largely based on a report by the Productivity Commission. I thought that the Productivity Commission report was a good report, as did my Shadow Minister, Senator Concetta Fierravanti-Wells. On this issue, there isn't an enormous difference between the Coalition and the Government, but we do need to try to ensure that the providers, that the nurses, that the other workers in these aged care centres who do such a terrific job, and are so helpful to very vulnerable Australians, don't have to spend as much time on paperwork as they currently do under a paper-based accountability system.
Will you implement those Productivity Commission recommendations?
Well, we have no plans to make significant changes to the system that the government's put in place.
Prime Minister.
Aged care is a vital issue, and it's important that you've raised it here. It is a growing challenge for the country as our population ages, and any country worth its salt is seeking to deal with this in an effective way. In terms of the core elements of what we've put forward, part of it goes to how it's financed, part of it goes to another core element, which is how do we enable people to age with dignity in a home environment as well. And frankly, can I just make one point about that? It goes back to the National Broadband Network. Through more attentive and accurate care systems which can be delivered online, as we roll out this system, aged care is going to be a huge beneficiary in terms of monitoring a person's health and well-being, bringing in one-on-one treatment when it's needed, and to make it better for families, and particularly for those of us who have had aged parents and who have seen the needs which lie ahead. There's one other thing I'd say as well, and Mr Abbott just mentioned the workforce. I agree with him. Our nurses out there do a fantastic job in the aged care sector, more broadly across the health sector. One of the things they have always been worried about, and I've dealt with many of them in my own electorate, is whether if there is any future change, as Mr Abbott has indicated, to the Fair Work Act, what will happen to their industrial conditions. They've said this to me 1,000 times. They're deeply worried about it. We need to have more people attracted to working in that sector, caring for people in aged care homes, but also becoming part of that professional network of carers which assists in caring for people more at home, using the new technologies which can do that.
But you don't see any further change to your policy?
I'm of the view, and I note very carefully what the Productivity Commission has said, I believe because this is a growing challenge for the nation, this must be kept under continuing review. It's only fair to seniors who have served our country so well that they are guaranteed of proper care into the future.
Our next question comes from Peter Harcher.
Mr Abbott, setting aside some of your earlier comments on climate change, you said here in this press club in January that climate change is real, that humanity is contributing, and that strong, effective policy is required to deal with it.
Thank you for remembering what I said, Peter.
I'm happy to quote you back to you anytime, Mr Abbott. particularly when I can get you to tell us if you're going to honour your commitments, because you and the government have both committed to cut carbon emissions by a minimum of 5% by 2020 and up to as much as 25%, depending on international progress. Under global negotiations, Australia will have to decide next year on the next phase. Will you keep your commitment? If there is global progress, will you agree to cut carbon emissions above and beyond the 5% target? And Mr Rudd, a part of that question for you, what would you do to help prepare Australia for climate change impacts?
Well, Peter, I'd rather deal with the facts rather than with hypotheticals. We will reduce emissions by 5% by 2020 through what we call direct action, rather than through a great big new tax. Or it's not a new tax now, it's an existing tax, and a tax that's just going to increase if Mr Rudd gets re-elected to $38 a tonne by 2020. We will do this by going to the market and purchasing what we think are cost-effective ways of getting reduced emissions. More trees, better soils, smarter technology. That's what we'll be doing. We will deliver the 5% reduction. If you actually look at the modelling that Mr Rudd's government released back in 2011, under the carbon tax, our domestic emissions go up by 8% by 2020, not down by 5%, and you've got to buy about $3.5 billion worth of carbon credits from abroad to get the reduction that they're seeking.
Your commitment rather than Mr Rudd's. If there is international progress, would you keep your commitment to consider cuts above and beyond the 5%?
Well, we've always said that if circumstances change, we will adjust appropriately, but there is no way that other countries are embracing the kind of carbon tax and the kind of emissions trading scheme that Australia has. If anything, the trend is all the other way. And if you look at what's happened in this country of ours, our emissions intensity has reduced by some 50% over 2 decades because companies have tried to make sensible savings in their energy usage.
Prime Minister.
Well, climate change is central to Australia's future. I spoke before about the need for a new way to embrace the challenges of the future. Let me tell you, climate change is there front and centre. And we will be doing a disservice to our kids and our grandkids if we do not act. That's why we brought in the mandatory renewable energy target of 20%. That's why we now are moving towards an emissions trading scheme. That's why, despite the Howard government being in office for 12 years, I, as one of my first acts, ratified the Kyoto Protocol. These are important measures, important steps, and we've never doubted the science, unlike some. On the key question of impacts, which Peter went to before, what really frightens the hell out of me, to be blunt, is in my own state of Queensland, the impact on the Great Barrier Reef over time. It's a very fragile ecosystem. It's been knocked around by storms and extreme weather events, which may be the product of climate change, according to CSIRO scientists. That is, more extreme weather events, the more climate change intensifies. And so we therefore have no alternative but to act collaboratively with the rest of the world.
And your willingness to increase the target if the rest of the world shows action?
Well, we honour our international obligations and we will make a careful judgment about what the rest of the world does. Can I just also correct just a figure before? Mr Abbott was pointing to increased carbon prices. We're moving towards an emissions trading scheme. I've announced the abolition of the carbon tax. That would bring down the price from $26 a tonne to $6 a tonne. That's a fact. People just need to be aware of that.
You do forecast it to increase.
But hang on, can I just add one other thing too? Mr. Electricity emissions, under the measures we've taken in this country, have already been reduced by 7%. I'm further advised that under the policies we've had now in place for several years, carbon emissions are stopping increasing.
Okay.
Now, we are starting to see the product of real policy at work for our kids' future.